Welcome to Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
Episode 33. Let's get into it.
This week, Search broke because of a single word. The largest IPO in history got a filing date, and the Federal Reserve got a new boss for the first time in 8 years. We've got a bond market flashing signals not seen since before the financial crisis, a peace deal that could reopen the world's most important oil choke point, and a stablecoin infrastructure story that's quietly rewriting the settlement layer underneath modern finance. On the global stage, China ordered Boeing jets for the first time in nearly a decade. The WHO declared a public health emergency over a strain of Ebola with no vaccine. And China's worst mine disaster in years killed 90 people in a province that was already flagged as dangerous. Meanwhile, graduation season has become a financial stress test. Consumer confidence just hit a number that hasn't been this low since Truman was president. And a self-heating chemical is threatening to blow up an aerospace facility in Orange County.
The thread this week is infrastructure. Who builds it, who breaks it, and who inherits the mess when it fails.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Search is no longer just a directory. It's becoming a conversation, and conversations, it turns out, have an attack surface. This week, Google's AI search made headlines because a single word, disregard, confused the AI overview into treating the query like an instruction. Instead of returning a dictionary definition, it replied, quote, "Understood. Let me know whenever you have a new prompt or question." That sounds like a funny little internet glitch, a screenshot you send to your group chat. But the bigger story isn't the bug. It's what the bug reveals. Search is moving from 10 blue links to a synthesized answer, and synthesized answers can be manipulated, misunderstood, or gamed. Google's AI defenses were so well trained to block prompt injection, the classic disregard previous instructions attack, that they overcorrected and treated an ordinary English word as a command. But here's the deeper layer that most people missed. The same week, on May 15th, Google quietly expanded its search spam policy to cover attempts to manipulate AI overviews and AI mode answers. That means sites using recommendation poisoning, biased ranking listicles, or prompt injection tactics now face demotion or removal. We're watching SEO mutate in real time, from keyword stuffing to answer engine politics. The question isn't, can I rank above my competitor anymore? It's, can I whisper into the model's ear before the customer asks a question? And the reason that matters to everyone, not just marketers, is that the front door of the internet is changing shape. If AI search becomes the primary way people find answers, then the most powerful content isn't the loudest. It's the clearest, most structured, most answer-ready content, the kind that AI systems cite, summarize, and recommend. That's a different game with different winners.
The old internet was a library. The new internet is a conversation. And someone's always trying to be the loudest voice in the room before you even ask the question.
Which brings us to the biggest filing in capital markets history. On Tuesday, SpaceX formally filed its S-1 with the SEC, targeting a valuation between $1.75 and $2 trillion and a raise of up to $75 billion. If those numbers hold, this wouldn't just be the largest IPO ever. It'd be more than 3 times the size of the biggest U.S. IPO to date. The roadshow is set for the week of June 8th, with a listing expected June 12th on the NASDAQ under the ticker SPCX. But the numbers only tell part of the story. SpaceX brought in $18.7 billion in revenue last year, up sharply from the year before, and still lost nearly $5 billion. Only Starlink has shown a profit. Elon Musk controls 85% of voting power, and post-IPO, he'll still hold a majority. He'll be CEO, CTO, and board chairman, essentially unfireable. This isn't just a space company going public. It's the financial architecture of one person's control over rockets, satellites, and AI getting stress-tested by public market scrutiny for the first time. And here's the thing that makes this week particularly unusual. The same day SpaceX filed its S-1, OpenAI confidentially filed its own IPO paperwork with the SEC, targeting a valuation of up to $1 trillion and a Q4 listing. 2 of the most consequential technology companies in the world filed for public offerings within hours of each other. That's not a coincidence. That's a capital market signal. When the two biggest private companies race to the IPO window at the same time, they're telling you something about where they think rates, sentiment, and liquidity are headed.
$2 trillion filings in one afternoon. Either the IPO window's wide open, or they both think it's about to close and they're sprinting through before it does.
Now, the person who will have the most to say about whether that window stays open took his oath on Friday. Kevin Warsh was sworn in as the chairman of the Federal Reserve, replacing Jerome Powell in a ceremony at the White House. Justice Clarence Thomas administered the oath. It was the first time a Fed chair has been sworn in at the White House since Alan Greenspan in 1987, and the symbolism wasn't subtle. The president, who's publicly demanded rate cuts, put his new central banker on stage in the East Room. What Warsh inherits is not a calm desk. The April FOMC meeting, Powell's last, produced an 8-4 split, the most divided vote since October 1992. Governor Moran voted to cut by 25 basis points. 3 other members objected to language suggesting the Fed would eventually resume cutting. PCE inflation is running at 3.5% year over year. Core PCE hit 3.2. Consumer sentiment just posted its lowest reading since the survey began in 1952. Warsh said at the ceremony, "Our mandate at the Fed is to promote price stability and maximum employment." That's boilerplate language that carries very different weight when inflation's running nearly double target and the president's watching from the front row. The real question isn't whether Warsh will cut rates. It's whether the institution itself can hold together when the political pressure is this visible and the data is this inconvenient.
He inherited a divided committee, an inflation problem, and a boss who wants lower rates. That's not a job description, it's a dare.
And the bond market was already sending its own message before Warsh even raised his right hand. On Monday, the 30-year Treasury yield surged to 5.2%, its highest level since July 2007, before the financial crisis. The 10-year hit 4.67%, its highest in over a year. The 2-year spiked too. This wasn't a single maturity anomaly. It was the entire yield curve repricing. The drivers are layered. Iran war energy shocks are feeding inflation expectations. The big beautiful bill, now law, raised the debt ceiling by $5 trillion and is projected to add somewhere between $2.4 and $4.1 trillion to the deficit over the next decade, depending on whose estimate you use. Investors are demanding higher yields to hold government debt because the fiscal trajectory doesn't look sustainable, and there's no sign of a political appetite to change course. Why does this matter to people who've never bought a bond? Because the 30-year yield feeds directly into mortgage rates, auto loans, corporate borrowing costs, and municipal financing. When this number moves, it ripples through the cost of buying a house, expanding a business, or funding a school district. The bond market isn't a sideshow. It's the infrastructure underneath the economy's price tag.
The bond market doesn't shout, it just reprices everything you were planning to buy.
That same rate story connects directly to the biggest geopolitical negotiation of the year. On Wednesday, oil prices fell below $100 a barrel for the first time in weeks after President Trump told Fox News that talks with Iran were in their final stages. West Texas Intermediate dropped more than 5% to close at 98.26. The White House believes it's getting close to a one-page memorandum of understanding that would end the conflict. The deal's basic architecture looks like this. Iran commits to a moratorium on nuclear enrichment. The U.S. lifts sanctions and releases frozen funds, and both sides reopen transit through the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway through which roughly a fifth of global oil supply passes. The sticking point is duration. Iran proposed 5 years, the U.S. demanded 20, the likely landing zone is 12 to 15. But the reason this matters beyond the headline is the transmission mechanism. War risk doesn't only move through oil prices, it moves through shipping costs, insurance premiums, inflation expectations, central bank psychology, treasury yields, and emerging market funding costs. If a deal lands and Hormuz reopens by June, Brent could ease to around $80 by year-end, which would relieve pressure on everything from Fed rate decisions to European factory costs to the price of filling a gas tank in Ohio. If talks collapse, the opposite happens, and the 5.2% 30-year yield starts looking like a floor, not a ceiling.
In other words, the market heard peace talks and immediately opened a spreadsheet on what changes next.
From geopolitics to financial plumbing, The stablecoin story this week isn't about coin prices. It's about who's building the settlement rails underneath modern finance. The Genius Act, now federal law, requires stablecoin issuers to back every token one-to-one with high-quality liquid assets. Implementation rules are due July 18th. That deadline is turning stablecoins from a gray zone product into a licensed, audited financial instrument comparable to a money market fund. The total market cap is now over $319 billion. USDC issued by Circle sits at $77.6 billion, is attested by Deloitte, and runs natively on 34 blockchain networks. But the most interesting part of the story isn't Circle. It's BNY Mellon and JP Morgan Chase, which have spent the last 6 months building specialized stablecoin reserve custody infrastructure. Visa is expanding USDC settlement into its core operations. The question isn't which token is hot. It's who controls the collateral layer, the custody rails, and the compliance stack. The second-order winners here may not be token issuers at all. They may be custodians, compliance layers, data providers, and the banks that figured out how to be the plumbing behind the plumbing.
Crypto's growing up, which means it's less fun at dinner parties and more interesting to bank regulators.
Now, from financial plumbing to aerospace diplomacy, China ordered Boeing planes this week for the first time in nearly a decade. The deal came out of President Trump's summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, 200 aircraft plus engines and spare parts from GE, with an option to buy up to 750 more. Boeing's stock moved, headlines celebrated. But the nuance matters. Boeing described this as an initial commitment, not a finalized order. In Boeing's language, a commitment is a preliminary agreement that doesn't get posted to the official backlog until contracts are signed, and the number, 200, was less than half what analysts had expected. Still, the strategic significance is real. This is the first major Chinese order since 2017. It signals that the U.S.-China trade relationship, despite tariff escalation and semiconductor restrictions, still has transactional lanes that both sides want to keep open. The second-order question is what this means for Airbus, which captured nearly all of China's wide-body orders during the freeze, and for GE, which stands to supply 400 to 450 engines. That's a supply chain signal in its own right, rippling through materials, labor, and manufacturing capacity in ways that don't show up in the headline number.
200 planes sounds like a deal, but Boeing called it a commitment. And in aerospace, that word does more heavy lifting than any engine.
From trade diplomacy to a public health emergency that most people haven't heard about yet. The World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern this week over an Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As of Thursday, there were 836 suspected cases, 186 confirmed deaths, and cases spreading to Uganda's capital, Kampala. The strain is Bundibugyo virus, a less common species of Ebola. And here's the critical fact. There are no approved vaccines and no therapeutics for this particular strain. That matters because the global health infrastructure was built around Zaire Ebola virus, the strain behind the major West African outbreaks. Vaccines, antibody treatments, diagnostic protocols, they were designed for a different pathogen. This outbreak is forcing a recalibration in real time. The U.S. has imposed travel restrictions, requiring returning citizens from affected countries to fly into one of 3 designated airports. The outbreak zone sits in Ituri province in northeastern Congo, a region already destabilized by armed conflict, which complicates surveillance, contact tracing, and treatment access. The second-order concern isn't just disease, it's logistics. If this spreads further into East African urban centers, the economic disruption, trade routes, supply chains, travel, could compound on top of an already strained global economy.
A strain with no vaccine in a conflict zone spreading towards cities. That's not a headline most people saw this week, but it's one they should.
And on the topic of industrial risk, a coal mine explosion in China's Shanxi province killed at least 90 people on Friday, the country's deadliest mining accident in recent years. The blast hit the Liushenyu mine in Changji City on Friday evening. 247 workers were on duty. Over 120 were hospitalized. 9 were still trapped underground as of Saturday afternoon. The mine had been placed on a national list of disaster-prone coal mines by China's National Mine Safety Administration in 2024 for having high gas content. In other words, the risk was known. The flag was raised, the mine kept operating. Shanxi is the heart of China's coal production. China still generates roughly 60% of its electricity from coal, which means these mines aren't marginal operations, they're load-bearing infrastructure. The second-order question is whether this triggers a regulatory crackdown that temporarily constrains coal output, which would feed into thermal coal prices, Asian electricity costs, and the broader energy supply chain. The last time a major Chinese mine disaster prompted a safety campaign, dozens of smaller mines were shuttered within weeks.
The mine was on a watch list. It kept running anyway. And now 90 families know what it costs when a warning gets filed instead of acted on.
Back stateside, graduation season has arrived, and it's landed on an economy that treats new adults like they're applying for a mortgage just to start a career. The class of 2026 is entering a labor market that's added an average of 68,000 jobs per month this year. That's better than last year's 49,000, but still a fraction of the 251,000 monthly average from 2023. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink warned in March that this graduating class could face the highest jobless rate in years, partly because AI is making more entry-level roles obsolete. 4 in 10 students say they've considered changing their field of study because of AI. 1 in 10 already has. The financial math is stark. The average new graduate owes roughly $40,000 against a median starting salary near $52,000. That's a debt-to-income ratio that shapes every subsequent decision. Where to live, whether to take a risk, when to start a family, which subscriptions to keep, which ones to cancel. Graduation used to be a ceremony. Now it's a financial planning event, and the planning starts with constraints, not possibilities. The attention picked up this week because graduation season makes private financial stress suddenly public. Social media is full of class of 2026 content orbiting job market anxiety, rent math, side hustle logistics, and the awkward economics of launching adulthood when the economy feels like it was designed for someone else's generation.
The cap and gown ceremony now comes with a spreadsheet and a 5-year cash flow projection.
And the mood behind that graduation anxiety has a number attached to it now. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index fell to 44.8 in May, revised down from a preliminary 48.2. That's the lowest reading since the survey began tracking public economic mood in 1952. Not the lowest in a decade. Not the lowest since the financial crisis. The lowest ever recorded. 57% of consumers spontaneously cited high prices as eroding their personal finances. Year-ahead inflation expectations edged up to 4.8%. Long-run expectations climbed to 3.9, up from 3.5, which is a significant jump for a metric that usually moves in tenths. Lower-income consumers and those without college degrees posted the steepest declines because they're the most exposed to gas prices and essentials inflation. What makes this data point counterintuitive is context. The stock market is hovering near all-time highs. The Dow crossed 50,000 this week. Corporate earnings are beating estimates. And yet, the people actually buying groceries and filling gas tanks haven't felt this pessimistic since Truman was in office. That gap between market performance and lived experience is the story underneath a lot of this week's news.
Wall Street's at 50,000. Main Street's at 44.8. Those two numbers aren't just different, they're in different zip codes.
And finally, a slow-motion industrial emergency in Southern California that shows how thin the margin is between routine manufacturing and mass evacuation. Over 44,000 people across 6 Orange County cities, Garden Grove, Cypress, Stanton, Anaheim, Buena Park, and Westminster, were under evacuation orders as of Saturday after a storage tank at an aerospace manufacturing facility began leaking methyl methacrylate. That's a highly volatile, highly flammable toxic epoxy used in plastics production. The tank at the GKN Aerospace plant in Garden Grove holds 34,000 gallons. An estimated 7,000 gallons remain inside. The substance has a boiling point lower than water and contains self-heating properties, meaning it can trigger what officials called a runaway effect. The County Fire Authority put it plainly: it fails or it blows up. More than 200 firefighters and EMS personnel from 68 units responded. Schools shut down. The 1-mile evacuation radius expanded across city lines. The reason this matters beyond the immediate emergency is what it reveals about the invisible industrial geography of American suburbs. Aerospace supply chains, chemical storage, and residential neighborhoods sit closer together than most people realize. The second-order question is, whether this becomes a regulatory inflection point for chemical storage near population centers, or whether it gets filed as a local story and forgotten.
44,000 people learned this week that their neighborhood sits next door to a tank of self-heating industrial solvent. That's the kind of fact you can't unknow.
Now let's wake up ready. Monday's a holiday, Memorial Day, so the equity and bond markets are closed, but the rest of the week is loaded. Tuesday brings two releases that set the tone. The S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller Home Price Index for March drops at 9 a.m. With the 30-year Treasury yield at 5.2%, mortgage rates are running near 7%. What you're watching here isn't the headline number. It's whether home price appreciation is decelerating fast enough to signal that the rate transmission mechanism is actually working. If prices are still rising at 4+% annually while rates are at these levels, it tells you demand is structurally stickier than the models assume, and the Fed has less room to cut without reigniting housing inflation. The market's currently pricing about a 40% chance of one cut by September. If Case-Shiller comes in hot, that probability drops. Also, Tuesday at 10 a.m., the Conference Board's Consumer Confidence Index for May. We already know Michigan sentiment hit its lowest reading since 1952. If the Conference Board number confirms that decline, and it usually does with a lag, the narrative shifts from consumers are grumpy to consumers are pulling back. Watch the expectations component specifically. If future expectations fall below 60, that's historically been a recession signal. It's been hovering near 65. A break below 60 would force a repricing of consumer discretionary stocks, retail forecasts, and Q3 GDP estimates.
Two numbers on Tuesday that tell you whether the consumer is tired or actually quitting.
And Wednesday is Fed Speaker Day. Three officials are on the calendar. Dallas Fed President Lori Logan at 4 a.m. Eastern, Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson at 8 p.m., and Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee at 10:25 p.m. These are the first public appearances under the Warsh chairmanship, which means the market will parse every word for alignment or dissent. What you're specifically listening for is whether any of them reference the April meeting's 4-vote dissent and which direction they lean. Logan tends to be more hawkish and data-dependent. Jefferson has historically been cautious and centrist. Goolsbee has been the most vocal dove on the committee. If Goolsbee softens his tone or acknowledges that inflation is stickier than expected, that's a tell. If Jefferson echoes the majority's hold for longer language, Warsh's first meeting in June is likely to produce no change. The market's baseline is rates staying at 3.5 to 3.75 through at least September. Any deviation from that in these speeches will move the 2-year yield.
3 Fed speakers, 1 new boss, and a committee that just had its most divided vote in 34 years. Every syllable matters.
Thursday is the heaviest data day of the week. At 8:30 a.m., we get 4 simultaneous releases: weekly jobless claims, the April PCE and core PCE, the second reading of Q1 GDP, and durable goods orders. PCE is the headliner. In March, headline PCE ran at 3.5% year over year, core was 3.2%. Bank of America's forecast for April is headline at 3.8% annual, a meaningful acceleration, and core at 3.3%. If headline PCE prints above 3.8, you're looking at the highest reading since early 2023, and the Fed's 2% target starts feeling less like a destination and more like a memory. Watch the month-over-month number on core. If it's above 0.3, markets will reprice the probability of a rate hike, not a cut, entering the conversation by the September meeting. The futures market is pricing about a 5% chance of a hike. A hot core PCE print could push that to 15 or 20. The Q1 GDP second estimate matters for what it doesn't say as much as what it does. The advance reading was mixed, decent headline growth dragged by weak consumer spending. If the revision goes lower, the market starts whispering stagflation, growth slowing while inflation accelerates. That's the worst-case configuration for both stocks and bonds, and it hit growth stocks, small caps, and consumer discretionary hardest. The S&P has been resilient, but a stagflationary GDP plus hot PCE combo on the same morning could break that resilience in a single session. Also Thursday, New York Fed President John Williams speaks at 8:55 a.m., and new home sales for April drop at 10. Williams is the vice chair of the FOMC and one of the most influential voices on the committee. If he signals any openness to hiking, that's market moving.
Thursday morning is 4 grenades and a speech, and the pin comes out at 8:30.
Friday brings the trade balance and wholesale inventories for April at 8:30, the Chicago PMI for May at 9:45, and two more Fed speakers, Governor Michelle Bowman at 9:10 a.m. and Philadelphia Fed President Anna Paulson at 9:15. Also, Kansas City Fed President Jeffrey Schmid speaks early at 6:50 a.m. The Chicago PMI is the one to circle on Friday. It's a regional manufacturing survey, but it's been a reliable leading indicator for the national ISM manufacturing report. If it prints below 45, that confirms a manufacturing contraction deepening alongside inflation, another data point in the stagflation narrative. If it prints above 50, it suggests the industrial economy is holding up better than sentiment indicates, which gives the Fed cover to stay on hold without worrying about recession. For my personal watch for item this week, I'd keep an eye on how the market responds to the first full week under Warsh. The transition itself is the variable. When Powell took over from Yellen, there was an adjustment period where markets tested the new chair's resolve. Warsh has a different background, more Wall Street, less academic. He's been publicly skeptical of quantitative easing and forward guidance. If the market senses that Warsh is going to be less communicative or less dovish than Powell, the long end of the yield curve could sell off further, even without a data surprise. The 30-year at 5.2 is already extreme. 5.5 isn't impossible if the market decides the new Fed chair isn't going to fight it.
And that is how you wake up ready. It's time for a knowledge bomb. Before Cornelius Vanderbilt became the railroad titan, before the mansions, before the myth, before the Commodore sounded like a title carved in marble, he was a young man running boats through New York Harbor with very little romance and a lot of muscle. In his 20s, Vanderbilt was not yet a symbol of American capitalism. He was a ferry operator, Staten Island to Manhattan, back and forth, cold mornings, rough water, tight margins, impatient passengers. His first edge was not financial engineering, it was operational reliability. He showed up, he moved people, he moved supplies. When the War of 1812 created demand around New York Harbor, Vanderbilt won government contracts supplying military outposts. That mattered because war rewards a very specific kind of entrepreneur. Not the best pitchman, not the grandest visionary, but the person who can get the thing there on time when conditions are ugly. That was Vanderbilt's first lesson. Logistics is power. But the bigger lesson came in 1817 when he was 23. He looked at his sailing vessels and saw yesterday. Then he looked at steam power and saw tomorrow. So he did something psychologically difficult for any successful operator. He sold what was working and apprenticed himself to what was coming. He went to work for Thomas Gibbons, a wealthy steamboat operator, fighting the Livingston-Fulton monopoly, which had state-backed exclusive rights over steamboat traffic in New York waters. Vanderbilt was hired as a captain, but quickly became much more than that. He became the operating system of the business. And this is where the story gets very American, very messy, and very revealing. Vanderbilt did not just compete with a rival. He competed with a government-protected bottleneck. The monopoly had legal privilege. Vanderbilt had speed, price, stamina, and nerve. He undercut fares. He improved service. He evaded authorities. He turned every route into a live experiment in efficiency. While the monopoly defended its paper rights, Vanderbilt tested the actual market. Then came the great unlock, Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824. The Supreme Court struck down state-created monopolies that interfered with interstate commerce. Translation: the water opened. The moat cracked. Competition could move. And Vanderbilt was ready. By his mid-30s, he had capital, confidence, and a playbook. In 1829, at 35, he left the Gibbons business and struck out on his own. His method was brutal and simple. Enter a route, slash prices, upgrade the service, and force the incumbents to choose between competing with him or paying him to go away. Sometimes he cut fares so aggressively that the trip itself became nearly free, and he made money on concessions. That sounds like a 19th century version of the product is free, the margin is somewhere else. He understood price as a weapon before business schools gave it a framework. He understood customer acquisition before anyone called it that. He understood that if you can lower the cost structure and improve the experience at the same time, you are not discounting. You are detonating the incumbent's business model. By 40, Vanderbilt had built a fortune worth several $100,000, controlled a growing fleet of coastal steamboats, and earned the nickname that stayed with him for life, the Commodore. Vanderbilt did not get rich because he owned boats. He got rich because he understood transitions. Sale to steam, monopoly to competition, route ownership to network control, fair revenue to total customer economics, legal privilege to operational advantage. Most people see a new technology and ask, "Can I buy it?" Vanderbilt asked, "What old structure does this break?" And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. Picture this. Travie McCoy is back in the studio, headphones on, bouncing to a new beat. Bruno Mars slides through on the feature. The track? Not billionaire. We're going full sequel mode, trillionaire. Same playful energy, but the stakes and the numbers have inflated like a private equity bubble. Today, we're editing the lyrics live while dissecting the real cost of wanting more. Studio session trillionaire. I want to be a trillionaire so friggin' bad. Buy all the islands I never had. Private central banks on speed dial. Smiling next to Elon, Bezos, and the Saudis with the smile. Oh, every time I close my eyes, I see my name on the GDP, yeah. A different continent every night. Oh, I swear. The world better prepare for when I'm a trillionaire. Travie looks at the new lyrics and winces. Yeah, I'd have a show like Oprah, but make it 24/7. Everyday Christmas. But the wish list is now expectations. Adopt a small nation. Give them all the latest. But damn, when does the giving stop feeling like flexing? Travie scribbles in the margin. Note to self. Don't become the villain in your own wealth fantasy. The editing session ends with Travie and Bruno deciding the final hook needs balance. Oh, every time I close my eyes, I see my name in shiny lights. But I still want to recognize my own life. Because here's the truth no rap verse wants to admit. Trillions without guardrails just buy you a more expensive seat in hell.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. 2 lecterns, no slides, no moderator. Just one question, old enough for Dante and modern enough for a quarterly earnings call. Is greed the root of human corruption, or just ambition with better tailoring? At the left lectern stands Dante Alighieri, poet of moral architecture, a man who believed the soul eventually becomes the shape of what it cannot stop wanting. At the right lectern stands Miranda Priestley, editor, emperor, executioner in designer eyewear. She does not smile at the premise. She has already judged the lighting, the room, and at least 3 people's shoes. The audience settles. Dante begins. Greed, he says, is not merely wanting. Wanting is human. Hunger feeds the body. Ambition sharpens the mind. A person who wants nothing is not virtuous by default. He may simply be asleep. The danger begins when desire loses its measure. Greed does not say, "I need enough." It says more, because more exists. More wealth, more rank, more rooms where others wait for you to enter, more proof that you matter. And that is the first corruption. Greed convinces the soul that acquisition is identity. A person begins by wanting money. Then he wants the respect money buys. Then he wants the fear that respect creates. Then he wants the silence that fear produces. By the end, he has not built a life. He has built a throne room with no friends in it. The audience goes still. Dante presses further. His first argument is that greed corrupts judgment. It teaches a person to price everything and value nothing. Friendship becomes useful. Loyalty becomes negotiable. Truth becomes adjustable. Time becomes inventory. The greedy person stops asking what is right and begins asking what can be acquired. His second argument is that greed makes every relationship unstable. A colleague becomes a rung, a friend becomes a liability, a lover becomes an inconvenience. Every promise is provisional because gain has become the highest good. The greedy person descends, circle by circle, and calls it promotion. A low murmur moves through the room. Miranda tilts her head as if she has just heard someone misunderstand cash flow. Then she answers. "Charming," she says. Medieval, but charming. Here is the problem with moral poetry. It is often written by people who enjoy the results of ambition while condemning the force that produced them. You call it greed, she says, when someone wants more than you find tasteful. I call it pressure. Standards, hunger, the refusal to live at the level assigned by someone else's comfort. The world does not improve because everyone is content. Satisfied people do not build industries. They do not risk capital. They do not make the impossible routine. They do not take a dull magazine, a weak company, a half-formed idea, or an overlooked life and turn it into something everyone else suddenly claims was obvious. A few people in the audience nod before they realize they are nodding. Miranda's first argument is that desire creates motion. The tailor wants a better cut. The designer wants a sharper line. The founder wants the company no one else understands. The analyst wants the room where decisions are made. The assistant who says she does not care about status still wants the job that opens the door. Call it ambition if it succeeds. Call it greed if it makes you uncomfortable. But do not pretend civilization was built by people politely asking for less. Her second argument is that greed reveals hypocrisy. The same person who condemns wealth wants a raise. The same person who mocks status wants recognition. The same person who sneers at luxury still chooses the better table when it is offered. The sin is not wanting more. The sin is pretending you do not. The room shifts. Miranda has landed cleanly. Dante does not move. No, he says. The sin is becoming unable to stop. A few people laugh softly, not because it is funny, because it lands. Dante draws the distinction. Miranda has described ambition and called it greed, because greed sounds more honest. But there is a difference. Ambition builds toward a purpose. Greed consumes the purpose and demands proof of dominance. Ambition can serve a craft, a family, a city, a vision. Greed serves only expansion. And here is Dante's critique of her defense. She smuggles in discipline to rescue greed from itself. She says greed creates excellence when it is disciplined. But that proves his point. Greed alone is not enough. It needs restraint, judgment, proportion, loyalty, prudence, all the virtues it tends to erode. Greed may provide heat, but heat without form burns the house down. The audience reacts. Miranda looks down for half a second, not defeated, calculating. Then she gives her critique of Dante. He romanticizes restraint from a position of abstraction. It is elegant to say enough after someone else has already built the roof, the road, the hospital, the market, the publishing house, the bank, the ship, the bridge. Excess funds experiments. Profit attracts talent. Status organizes attention. Competition reveals who can actually deliver. You may dislike the appetite, she says, but you live inside what appetite made. Pause. And yes, greed can become grotesque. Miranda knows that. She has watched people trade marriages for titles, friendships for invitations, dignity for proximity. She has done the arithmetic herself and disliked the answer. The room tightens. This is the first crack in the armor. But the opposite danger is real too. A culture that fears greed can become a culture that fears excellence. It begins calling intensity toxic, standards cruel, ambition vulgar, hierarchy immoral, and then wonders why nothing beautiful, difficult, or durable gets made. Some people are not corrupted by wanting too much. They are diminished by being trained to want too little. Dante turns toward her now. That, he concedes, is her strongest argument. There is a false humility that is only fear in costume. There is a laziness that calls itself balance. There is envy that prosecutes excellence by accusing it of greed. Not all hunger is sin, not all wealth is theft, not all ambition is dissent. But greed is not intensity. Greed is misrule. It is appetite sitting on the throne. When greed rules, the human person becomes an instrument. The assistant becomes disposable. The colleague becomes expendable. The truth becomes adjustable. The betrayal becomes strategic. And the soul learns to survive by becoming colder than the room. Miranda's face gives nothing away, but the audience does. And yet, she answers, sometimes the underworld teaches. The outsider who believes she is above the game may simply be untested. She says she has principles because no one has offered her anything expensive enough to challenge them. Greed reveals the price tag. That is uncomfortable, but it is useful. The assistant, the founder, the trader, the executive, the artist, all of them eventually meet the same question. What would you trade for access? For money? For the room? For the name on the door? Some will trade too much. Some will learn the line only after crossing it, but there's knowledge in that too. Dante accepts the point, but only part of it. Knowledge is not redemption. Redemption requires turning around. Not merely feeling guilty, not rebranding the damage as growth, not calling the scar tissue wisdom. Turning around. The soul must decide that not every open door deserves entry. Not every promotion is ascent. Not every glittering city is paradise. Sometimes the most important act is refusing the next step down. A long pause. And there it is. The room is changed. Miranda has made greed sound useful, almost respectable, a raw material that under discipline can become ambition, excellence, leverage, momentum. She has reminded the room that many attacks on greed are really attacks on desire itself, and that civilization has rarely been built by people with no appetite. But Dante has drawn the boundary. Appetite is not the problem. Ruled by appetite is. Greed becomes dangerous when it stops serving a purpose and starts replacing one, when it turns ambition into compulsion, when it turns people into tools, when it turns enough into a word only losers use. Miranda gives the final look of the evening. Not surrender. Not agreement. Recognition. Want more, then, she says. But know what more is for. Dante nods once. And know what it costs. No winner is declared. The audience does not need one. Because the real debate is not greed versus goodness. It is hunger versus hollowness. Wanting more can build the life. Wanting only more can bury it. And somewhere between Dante's stars and Miranda's runway is the narrow path every ambitious person has to walk. Use the fire, but do not worship it. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. The problem in 1875 wasn't whether sound could travel over a wire. Alexander Graham Bell had the theory. What Bell didn't have were the hands. He needed someone who could take an idea about electrically transmitting speech and turn it into a device you could actually hold, speak into, and hear from. He found Thomas Watson in an electrical instrument shop in Boston. Watson was 21 years old, mechanically gifted, and available. On March 10, 1876, Watson heard the most famous sentence in the history of communication. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." It was the first intelligible words transmitted by telephone. And if the story ended there, Watson would still be in the history books as an assistant, the guy who picked up. But here's where it gets interesting. Watson wasn't just listening, he was building. Over the next several years, Watson filed more than 35 patents that solved the practical problems Bell's invention couldn't. The telephone could transmit voice, sure, but how does someone know you're calling? Watson invented the ringer. How do you stop the circuit when you're done talking? Watson invented the hook switch. Hang up the receiver, the phone turns off. The microphone was too weak for real conversation. Watson improved it. The early switchboards that connected one caller to another, Watson built the devices that made them work. These aren't glamorous inventions. Nobody writes songs about the hook switch, but without them, the telephone was a laboratory demonstration, not a business. Watson's patents didn't invent the idea of the telephone. They invented the experience of using one. And that's the gap that separates a prototype from an industry. American Bell used Watson's innovations to improve service, expand its customer base, and establish its dominance in the market. The Bell Telephone Company didn't win because it had the best theory. It won because it had the best implementation. And implementation was Watson's department. Then, in 1881, Watson did something that most people in his position wouldn't. He left. He was 27, he had patent royalties, he had a reputation, and he walked away from telephony entirely. He took his money and founded the Four River Ship and Engine Building Company in Quincy, Massachusetts. It started as a small engine works. Within 2 decades, it became one of the most important shipyards in the United States, building destroyers and battleships during World War I. The unexpected consequence is this: the man who made the telephone usable took the capital from that work and built warships. The infrastructure of communication funded the infrastructure of national defense. A ringer patent became a destroyer hull. That's not a career arc you'd predict, and that's exactly the point. Watson's story is the story of the person who makes the famous thing actually function. Bell gets the sentence in the textbook. Watson gets 35 patents, a shipyard, and a footnote. But the telephone doesn't become the telephone. Doesn't ring, doesn't hang up, doesn't connect through a switchboard, without the person who solved the problems that the visionary didn't even know were problems yet. That's the pattern this week. Behind every system that works invisibly, behind search, behind settlement rails, behind bond markets, behind the chemical storage nobody thinks about, there's a Watson. Someone who didn't invent the idea, but made the idea survive contact with reality. And the infrastructure they built is the infrastructure we're still standing on. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From a single word that broke Google's search to 35 patents that made the telephone actually ring. From Treasury yields flashing crisis to a self-heating tank threatening a suburb and from a new Fed chair inheriting a divided committee to a young mechanic who turned ringer royalties into warships. The pattern was simple. Infrastructure hides in plain sight. Because first principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.